Hi class, thanks for coming back for more econ. Today we're going to keep going on part 2 of chapter 4. Just a little bit of a warning, there's going to be a lot of writing today because we're going to look at very minor differences in kind of two sets of words that sound similar but mean very different things. So I'm going to spell out a lot of things, there's going to be a lot of definitions. So just make sure you have a pencil handy and that you're definitely taking notes today. So this is chapter 4, part 2. And the main thing that I want to kind of drill home today is that a shift in the demand curve is different from a change in the quantity demanded. So I'm going to write this out and then we'll back up again and talk about it. So shifts in the demand curve are different from changes in quantity demanded. Okay, so we talked about quantity demanded last class. Quantity demanded was the number of units that buyers are willing and able to purchase. And quantity demandeds are plotted along the demand curve. So if we have a demand curve with price against quantity, and we have demand like that, then this curve is, again, just a series of coordinates where each coordinate gives you a particular price point and a particular quantity. Okay, these are the quantities that are demanded at different price points. So when we're talking about changes in quantity demanded, all that means is we're changing the position that we are sitting at along the horizontal axis. So if you move from here to here, there's been a change in the price, there's also been a change in the quantity demanded. Okay, so the reason I'm saying this is I want to highlight that a shift in the demand curve, we also call this a change in the demand, is entirely different than a change in the quantity demanded. Okay, so underneath here, we're going to first think about an increase in demand and what that means. Okay, an increase in demand is such that for any given price point, okay, I'll keep this graph and keep pointing at it. An increase in demand says that for any given price point, if you hold the price constant, then after there's been an increase in the demand, then at that same price point, there's now more units that are being demanded than before. So an increase in demand is the same thing as the whole demand curve increasing. So it's like this actual thing, the actual demand, is increasing, which is also going to be synonymous with shifting to the right. Okay, note again that an increase in demand, which is, again, the demand increasing, it's changing, is different than a change or even an increase in the quantity demanded. So an increase in the quantity demanded, this thing, would mean that you're along the demand curve, you're just changing the quantity that you're looking at, so you're sliding up. Again, that's different than an increase in the demand, which is shifting the curve. Okay, so to make sure this is in your notes correctly. Okay, an increase in demand is any change that increases the quantity demanded at every price. So it's going to be any change, put delta for change, that increases the quantity demanded at every price. Okay, when this happens, what's going to be true is that the demand curve is going, the whole curve is going to shift right. So demand curve shifts right. Okay, this is an increase in demand, which is an example of a change in the demand because the whole demand is changing. Okay, so that's an increase in the demand. What is a decrease in demand? Actually, let me write up at the top so I don't run out of room. So a decrease in demand is effectively just going to be the same idea but in reverse. So a decrease in demand is going to be such that let me start from the beginning. A decrease in demand is any change that decreases the quantity demanded at every price. Okay, so I'll just rewrite for completion. So it's going to be any change that decreases the quantity demanded, which again is what we're measuring along the horizontal axis. Demanded at every price. And if you think about how this would work, so it's any change that decreases the quantity demanded at every price. So that means if the price is here, then originally there was this many units that were demanded, this is the quantity demanded, but now there's a decrease in the quantity demanded, so it would have to be somewhere over here. And this is true for every price. So if the price is here, originally this was the quantity demanded, but now there's fewer, so maybe it's here. So this would be consistent with a leftward shift in the demand curve. So the demand curve shifts left. Okay, just to again make sure this is like especially highlighted in your brain, these are two examples of changes in the demand. These are different than changes in the quantity demanded. So changes in the quantity demanded correspond to you sliding up a curve that doesn't move its location. A change in the demand, either increase or the decrease, means the whole curve gets up and it moves either to the right if demand has increased, or to the left if demand has decreased. Okay, so that's, actually let me draw you a picture of this first. I'll draw you a picture and then I'll give you scenarios where we might see this happening. So, draw this real big since it's important. So suppose you have an original demand curve that looks like this. If there is an increase in demand, then again, what that means is that for any given price that you might look at, now people have a higher quantity demanded than before. So graphically, that's going to mean the curve shifts right. This is going to be an increase in demand. And if demand does increase, then that means since you're moving the curve, you can erase this one because the curve is moved from here to here. Again, since we're thinking about an increase in the quantity demanded, this has to be consistent with the curve shifting right. It's not intellectually quite accurate to think about this as a curve shifting up. It's shifting right because we're increasing the quantity demanded. Okay, a decrease in demand means that for any given price that you might look at, for example, this price, then whatever the original quantity demanded was, there has to now be a lower quantity demanded. And this is true for any given price that you might consider. So a decrease in demand would look like the curve moving from the black line to the red line. So this is a decrease in demand. And again, the curve is shifting left. It's not shifting down. It's moving left because we're thinking about pegging the price and then just taking each of the quantity demanded at that price and just moving either right or left. So it's a horizontal shift and not a vertical shift. Okay, so that's the picture. And now let me give you examples of things that actually can shift the demand or change the demand. Okay, here's where all the writing is going to happen. So make sure your notes here are thorough, and this will help you later on for the exam. Okay, here's bucket list. So these are examples of things that can change, which is also a way of, another way of thinking of this is things that can shift the demand. So again, we're thinking of scenarios in which the whole curve might get up and move either to the right or to the left. Okay, thing number one is income. Okay, now get your pencil ready. There's going to be 2 definitions here. I'm just going to start putting words up here and then I'll talk around them. So first thing is normal goods. I'll just make this not singular, or I'll make it singular. Normal goods and inferior goods. Okay, what are these things? Okay, a normal good is a good where if you hold everything else constant, so again, if we make this assumption of ceteris paribus, then an increase in a person's income causes a person's demand to go up. Okay, let me write and then we'll return. So, ceteris paribus. So again, if you hold everything equal, then an increase in income causes an increase in a person's demand. Okay, I need to give you something concrete to hold on to in your mind. Virtually every good that we think about is a normal good. So all that's required for a good to be a normal good is if you make a person richer, then they want more of that thing. So typically this is the case. So for example, cars are normal goods. If you have a person and you give them a higher salary, well, their demand for cars increases. Like they want to buy another car because they've got more money. Again, this is true for most things. So for most things, if you make a person richer, if you make their income go up, then they want more of the thing. So anytime that characterizes a good, then that good is a normal good. Okay, the opposite of a normal good is an inferior good. So an inferior good is one where if you hold everything else equal, so ceteris paribus, an increase in a person's income causes a decrease in the person's demand for the good. Okay, this is a little bit kind of wonky to think about. The example of an inferior good that my professor for undergrad econ used to give is hot dogs. So the idea is you don't observe a lot of millionaires eating hot dogs, but you observe a good number of college students eating hot dogs. Why? Because they're cheap. So the idea is for hot dogs, as you become richer, as your income goes up, then your demand for the good hot dog starts to fall. So hot dogs are an example of an inferior good. So anything that follows this pattern where if you make a person richer and they want less of that thing, that is an inferior good. Okay, so let's think about, again, how this influences shifts or changes in the demand. Okay, if we have a little demand curve, suppose we have a demand for something like TVs, and it's standard sloping, it's normal. And let's suppose, well, first of all, what is a TV? Is it a normal good or is it an inferior good? It's a normal good because if you get a raise, you're more likely to go out and buy a nice TV or upgrade or get another one. So it's a normal good. So let's think about what would happen in this market for TVs if everyone in the market got a raise at work, if their income went up. Well, if that was the case, then what would happen in the market is the whole demand curve would shift out to D prime, and you'd no longer have the original demand curve. Okay, what would happen in the market if the market for TVs, if we go into a recession? So maybe you're thinking about right now. And people's incomes fall. Well, in the TV market, since TVs are a normal good, anytime people start making less money, well, they're going to cut back on that thing. And so in that case, the demand curve would shift left. There'd be a decrease in demand if people's incomes go down. So again, an increase in income causes you to demand more. If you're thinking of a normal good, it works going backwards. So if you have a normal good, if a person makes less money, they have lower income, their demand will decrease. Okay, now let's think about an inferior good. So another example of inferior goods, let's see, what's another example of an inferior good? Ramen noodles. So millionaires don't eat those, college students eat them because they're cheap. So let's think about the demand for these bad noodles and what would happen in the market if people started making more money. Well, ramen noodles are, again, an example of an inferior good. So because they're an inferior good, if everyone, or if some people in the market start making more money, then the whole demand for ramen noodles is going to decrease, and so the demand will fall. It would work again in reverse. So if we're looking at the market for ramen noodles, and suddenly people start making less money, so again, we kind of hit a recession, then what would happen to the demand for ramen in recessions? Well, it would go up because it's a cheap thing to buy, and so people would demand more of it when their income falls. Okay, so this is thing number one that influences or causes changes in demand. Okay, thing number two, flip the page, is the price of relative goods. So the price of relative or related goods. Okay, here there's going to be two definitions nested inside here. So the first definition is substitutes. And second definition is going to be complements. Okay, so just as you can think of any good in the market and you can kind of think about whether it's a normal good or inferior good, like it has to be one of those two things. Similarly, another dimension that you can classify goods along is whether they're, or if you have two sets of goods, you can think about whether they're substitutes or complements. Okay, did not explain that well, so let me try this again. Okay, we're thinking about prices of related goods. So we're going to have the good for the market we're thinking about, and then another good that's in another market. And those two goods, they're relatives to each other. So if their relationship is such that they're substitutes, then what's going to be true is that substitutes are things you can use interchangeably. So as an example, a substitute for white bread is wheat bread. So those are two different things. There's two different markets for them, but you can use them interchangeably, so they're substitutes. Okay, so what good does that do us when we're thinking about changes in the demand? Well, if you have a market for white bread, and wheat bread is a relative, then the price of wheat bread actually affects the demand for white bread, the index market that we're thinking of. And it's going to be such that an increase in the price of one good, so one of the two things, leads to an increase in the demand for the other. So hopefully this is intuitive. So the idea here is you got white bread and wheat bread, they're substitutes for each other. And if there's an increase in the price of one good, so let's just say wheat bread becomes more expensive, well then what happens? There's going to be an increase in the demand for the other kind of bread, white bread. And the idea is if one thing becomes really expensive, let's just switch to the alternative that's cheaper. So, again, let's just plot this out here to make sure the picture is clear in your mind. Suppose we're thinking about white bread, and you got this entirely other market over here for wheat bread. So wheat bread has its own supply and demand curve. Suppose that something happens in the wheat bread market whereby the price of wheat bread just becomes really expensive. If wheat bread becomes really expensive, then what happens in this white bread market? Well, people start buying more white bread, and so the demand for white bread is going to increase. Okay, let's back up and think about this in reverse. What happens if the price of wheat bread falls? So maybe there's some sale on wheat bread. Well, wheat bread's a relative of white bread, so that decrease in the price of wheat bread is going to affect the demand in the white bread market. And if wheat bread becomes really cheap, if there's a sale, then people switch from white bread to wheat bread, And so the demand for the white bread is going to fall. Okay, that's substitutes. What are complements? Okay, complements are two goods that are only useful if they're used together. So this is kind of an outdated example, but it helps get the point across. CDs and CD players are complements. Like if you don't have a CD player, CDs do you no good. Similarly, if you don't have any CDs, then a CD player does you no good. So these are two things where one is useless without the other, or at least it doesn't have the same value to it. Okay, you can think about how this works with changes in the demand. So when we're thinking about two goods that are complements, then an increase in the price of one good is going to lead to now a decrease in the demand for the other. Okay, so let's think of another example so that this is a little bit more clear. Another example of complements. Suppose, okay, this isn't really realistic, but it's an example. Okay, right shoes and left shoes are complements. So if you only have one shoe, it doesn't really do you any good because you need two shoes to walk. So what this would say is if we're thinking about the market for right shoes, and then we're thinking about the market for left shoes, then an increase in the price of one good, so if maybe right shoes become really, really expensive, what would that do? It would cause there to be a decrease in the demand for left shoes because the left shoe only works if you got the right shoe, and now the right shoe is like millions of dollars and you can't afford it, so you don't want the left shoe either. Okay, so in the picture, suppose we're looking at the market for right shoes, and there's some demand curve for right shoes. If there's an increase in the price of left shoes, then what happens to the demand for right shoes? Well, it's going to decrease. Okay, again, back up and think about this in reverse just so your brain can kind of wrap itself around this. If suddenly left shoes become really, really cheap, well, then what does that do to your demand for right shoes? Well, if right shoes and left shoes are complements, then you'll have an increase in your demand for right shoes if left shoes suddenly see this big price reduction in left shoes. Okay, so that's thing number 2 that can change the demand curve. Okay, thing number 3 is tastes. So this one's a little bit less intensive, it's more straightforward. Okay, tastes are just how much you like the thing. So if there's a change in people's preferences for something, then that's going to change the demand curve. So, for example, what does this mean? A year ago, I had no taste whatsoever in a mask because why would I want a mask? So my taste for masks is relatively low. Now I kind of want to make sure I have some. So tastes for masks have changed. Okay, think about how this would affect the demand curve. So we got the market for masks. Now that people have a greater taste for masks, the whole demand curve is going to shift right. Because that's like saying for any given price point, there's more quantity of masks demanded today than there were last year. So maybe last year, let me draw this a little bit neater so I can get the point across. Maybe last year masks are being sold for $10 a piece. Well, last year, how many masks did I want if they're being sold for $10 a piece? I didn't want any. Now my tastes have changed. Now I actually have some interest in buying a mask. So now at a price of 10, I might want to buy 2. And so the quantity demanded is different at this same fixed price level. Hence, there's been a change in the demand. And it also works in reverse. So if preferences change such that people dislike something, then the whole demand curve just shifts to the left or shifts back. Okay, thing number 4 that can change the demand curve is expectations. Okay, I'm going to write and then I'll talk. So expectations work like this. If I expect an increase in my income, then that's going to increase my current demand. If I expect higher prices, then that is going to lead to an increase, draw an arrow to save space, an increase in my current demand. And both of these things work in reverse too. So what we've got here. So suppose you know you're going to get a job next year. Fingers crossed you get a job next year. So you're going to expect to have a higher income sometime in the future. So now let's think about your current demand for products. Well, if you know that you're going to get a really good job next year and you're going to be making lots of money, then what do you start doing? Kind of start living like you have that money now. So for things like tennis shoes, for example, maybe you got your eye on like a really nice pair of running shoes or basketball shoes, and you know next year you're going to be making lots of money. Well, maybe if this is your current demand for tennis shoes, then if you expect to be pretty rich next year, then for any given price point for tennis shoes, you're going to probably buy more of them, and so your demand is going to shift right. Again, it works in reverse. So if you expect your income to fall sometime in the future, then that's going to cause your current demand to shift back or move to the left, because it's like you anticipate you're not going to have much money, and so you kind of start living like that now, and you cut back some of your expenses. So for any given price of something, if you expect that you're going to be kind of cash strapped in the future, then even if the prices don't change, you just start demanding less of that if you expect to have a lower income in the future. Okay, what about this expectation of different prices? So the idea here is people want to get bargains when bargains are to be had. So let's think about the market for gasoline. Okay, if you know somehow that in the future the price of gas, or maybe tomorrow, you know that the price of gas is going to go up, well, what do? You go get gas today. And so your demand is going to shift to the right. Somehow, if you know that tomorrow the price of gasoline is going to be really cheap, like maybe you know, I don't know, they're going to find oil somewhere and instantaneously the price of gas is going to fall. Well, then if you expect that the price of gas is going to be like 50 cents per gallon tomorrow, then what do you do today? You definitely don't buy gas today. Like you hold off and you wait until tomorrow. And so today your demand for gasoline would fall if you expect the price of gasoline to be cheaper in the future. Okay, we're almost at the end here. So the next and last example of something that might change your demand, or might change the demand in a market, is the number of buyers. Okay, this one is very easy to understand. The idea is that when you're constructing a market demand curve, what do? You take the demand curve that belongs to Al, you take the demand curve that belongs to Bob, and then you add them up horizontally to get some market demand curve where the line is kind of like further to the right because you keep on moving out for each person. Okay, so what that means here is that if these two guys somehow find an extra person to be in the market, so maybe they get a little brother, then you're now going to have an extra person in the market. And so when you do the horizontal summation, you've got an extra leg to add along. So if you add extra people to the market and you horizontally add people, then that's going to cause the whole market demand curve to start shifting right. Similarly, if there's like a plague and people start dying, well, you start losing people. There's fewer horizontal segments to add, and so the demand curve would shift down. So the size of the population, or the size of the buyer population, is directly tied to the demand curve in terms of whether it's moving, how far left or right it is. Okay, almost at the end. So let me just draw you one final picture here. In case none of this made any sense. Maybe this will catch some of you, and then we'll practice. Okay, so I'm going to have two side-by-side pictures. First picture is going to be what it looks like if you have a change in the demand. Second picture is going to be what it looks like if you have a change in the quantity demanded. So a change in demand is going to look like a demand curve that shifts left or right. So a change in the demand is going to look like the demand curve either moving right if there's been an increase in demand, or moving left if there's been a decrease in demand. Okay, all of the examples that I gave you today are examples of things that would cause one of these two phenomena to occur. So changes in expectations, changes in the prices of relative goods, taste, those would all cause the whole demand to get up and move, because those are things where if you took the price of something and you pegged it at some level, then at that pegged price level, people actually consume different quantities of the good. So originally they were consuming this many, now maybe they're consuming less, and maybe they're consuming more. Okay, that is not to be confused with a change in quantity demanded. Okay, recall, quantity demanded is what we're plotting along the horizontal axis of demand curves. Okay, a change in quantity demanded simply means that if you're looking at some particular coordinate along the demand curve, and then the quantity demanded just changes, then you either move to another coordinate that's up here, or you move to another coordinate that's down here, but the fundamental relationship between the price and how many units people demand, that fundamental relationship hasn't moved. So the line stays pegged. It's just what's happening here is that the price level is changing. So if nothing else changes in the market, but a grocery store just has a sale on something, then the price will fall. We don't change the demand curve because the demand curve tells us what happens to quantity demanded as you just change the price. So if you have a sale, the price just goes down. Well, what will happen? People will just buy more of that bag of potato chips because it's cheaper. Similarly, what happens if the price of Mercedes goes up? Well, the fundamental relationship hasn't changed. They've just become more expensive. This tells us the fundamental relationship. So if originally the price was here and the price went up, then people would just demand fewer Mercedes if the price went up. Okay, so this is change in demand. The whole curve shifts. This is change in quantity demanded. You just slide along the same curve to different coordinates. Okay, so if any of this is confusing, type out your questions and I'll try to answer them in the next 10 minutes. And then after this, I'll give you some examples and you can attempt to identify whether we're thinking about changes in demand or changes in quantity demanded. So I will see you after 10 minutes. Okay, for the exercise today, I'm going to try to give you a happy example to hopefully make this a little bit less painful. So think about the market for USC football tickets. So we're just thinking about an actual ticket to get into a football game here at USC. And what I want you to think about for the exercise is for a series of scenarios, whether that particular scenario would result in a change in the quantity demanded of USC football tickets or a change in the demand for USC football tickets. Again, a change in the quantity demanded means the demand curve doesn't change, like it stays in the same location. So the fundamental relationship between prices of tickets and quantity demanded haven't changed. It's just the quantity demanded that you're looking at, the position along the horizontal axis that you're looking at is just moving. Again, change in demand means the whole line gets up and moves to the right or to the left. Okay, the second thing I want you to do after you have determined whether or not the line has moved location or you're just sliding along the line is whether the slide or the shift is right or left. So let me give you an example and then I'll give you the actual problems you have to answer. So suppose, again, this is not on your list of things you have to do, but suppose one of the things on the lineup was what would happen to the demand curve for USC football tickets if suddenly everybody gets a free subscription to the SEC network? Okay, sitting at home on the couch and watching football is a substitute for going to the game and watching it in person. So SEC network is kind of providing a replacement to the actual game. So if you look back on your notes, if you have two goods that are substitutes for each other, then if the price of one thing goes up, then the demand for the other thing goes up. So they move together. So now we have these tickets that we're thinking about the market for tickets, and the price of the subscription to the SEC network is now super cheap. Everybody gets it for free. So if that's the case, then what would happen to the demand for tickets? Well, if SEC network subscriptions are free, then more people are just going to want to stay at home and watch the game on TV. So the demand curve for tickets is going to change, and it's going to shift to the left. And so if that was your problem, if I said, for question one, what would happen if the SEC network gave away free subscriptions, then your response would be there would be a change in the demand. The shift in the demand curve would be such that the demand curve shifts to the left. Okay, that's the example. Now I'm going to give you 5 scenarios for you to think about. Scenario number 1 is what would happen to the demand for USC football tickets if we experienced just like a miserably hot fall. So if the weather was really bad and it's going to be like super, super steamy outside and uncomfortable to go to the games, then what would happen in the demand world? Scenario number 2 is what would happen if we just had like an especially good team. So like some year, like we're not just like kind of good, like we're really, really good. So if the team is like really good one season, then what would happen to the demand? Question number 3 is what would happen to demand if the ticket office runs a sale where all the tickets are sold at half price? Question number 4 is what would happen to demand if there's an increase in the size of the student population at USC? For this one, assume that students are consumers of football tickets. So assume that students go to the games. And scenario number 5 is what would happen to demand for USC football tickets if there's suddenly free concession food at Williams-Brice Stadium. So instead of having to pay anything for food, they just gave away all their food and beverages for free. Okay, so again, for each one, state whether there be a change in quantity demanded or a change in the demand. And then after that, whether the shift of the curve or the slide along the curve would be right or left. And then once you have that, then you'll be free to go off and enjoy the rest of your day.